Hi, my name's Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're building 4 banging bases for your miniatures. Sponsored by Skillshare. What up, Mini family? A little bit ago, I made a video very similar to this one wherein I claimed to show you guys how to build 4 easy bases. Hi, my name's Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're making 4 different easy-to-make bases. And the main complaint was,
Scott, these aren't that easy to build, you dang liar.
That's a pretty fair comment. So in this video, what we'll do is we'll create 4 bases, and on each trial, we'll get more and more difficult. Starting with the easiest one, the rainy graveyard. First things first, we're gonna create a gravestone out of styrene.
Scott, you said this was supposed to be easy. What the heck?
Yes, you're right, but hear me out. If you're the kind of person who's gonna make rainy graveyard bases, I gotta believe that you have a zombie kit or 2 laying around that has a gravestone pre-made already inside of it, so you can entirely skip this step. I'm fresh out of gravestones, so I had to build one, but it really isn't that difficult, so quit your complaining and give it a shot. I plot it out on styrene and then cut it with an X-Acto knife and then kind of awkwardly snap it out. Next, I drew up the edges with some sandpaper just to make the edge nice and crispy. Following that, I needed to add some details to the gravestone so it looked more like a gravestone. I took some even smaller styrene pieces and made a crucifix on the front and added a little decorative trim element to the bottom. If you're curious where I get my styrene, I buy it in bulk on eBay, and I have so much that I'll likely take it to the grave. Get it? To the grave? Once all my glue was dried, I filed down some of the overhang to true up the edges and clean it up. I then attached the gravestone to the base with some epoxy sculpt and also added a little zombie hand coming out of the grave that I had from a leftover sprue. Once I had everything positioned how I wanted, I started to add some dirt from the backyard that I cooked in the oven and pulsed in a tiny crappy blender. While I glue on the dirt, let me tell you about today's sponsor, and that's Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with a ton of different classes covering a wide variety of creative and entrepreneurial skills. Skillshare is a great place to engage in your creativity, your curiosity, and even further your career. For me personally, I'm always looking for ways to improve my videos, so I was interested in this Making the Most of Stock Footage class by Nikki Stevens to add some fun B-roll. But maybe for the Mini family, instead of taking advantage of B-roll, you guys would be more interested in learning how to sculpt your own miniatures with things like ZBrush or more traditional methods using clay. Premium membership includes unlimited access to all of Skillshare courses, so you can learn how to make your own figures or learn how to paint fluffy foxes in watercolor. I'm not judging. Skillshare is also incredibly affordable. An annual subscription costs less than $10 a month. And because Skillshare is sponsoring this episode, viewers of this channel can follow the link in the description to get 2 whole months free to Skillshare, giving them access to every single class on the platform. Thanks for sponsoring this episode, Skillshare. Now back to the bases. Once all the dirt was on, it was time for some priming and then mud. I took golden heavy gel matte, which is not matte at all, and mixed it with a dark brown pigment from Abteilung called Track Rust. I slopped the stuff on the base really thickly. I made sure to create little depressions like footprints that would later have pools of rainwater in them. Since this stuff takes forever to dry, I moved on to painting the gravestone with a brownish grayish color. After that, I sponged on some dark brown to give it some wear and tear and followed that up with a scratchy edge highlight. I did a video recently about weathering, and one thing I talked at length about was the idea of scratchy highlights and how that can give a nice roughened appearance to something that is otherwise undamaged and smooth. Next, I moved on to the zombie hand, which was real simple. 1 base coat and then 1 highlight. Easy peasy. It's a base, it doesn't need to be fancy. After that, I took some Mod Podge Dimensional Magic and mixed it with Plague Bearer Green, a Citadel contrast paint, and pooled that up in my footprints that I had made earlier. It should be noted that this stuff dries and shrinks a little bit, so you may need to apply this step a few times to build up a nice pool of water. Lastly, I stuck some grass tufts on the gravestone and around the base. Clean up your base room with some black paint and Bob's your uncle. Or in my case, Bob is literally my uncle.
Hi, I'm Bob, Scott's uncle. Now on to the next base.
For this base, I wanted it to ooze pirate life, so I started by adding some decking to the base. This is just balsa wood of various widths for a little variety that I super glued down to the base like a veneer. I also snapped one of these boards in half to later have a little octopus tentacle sticking out of. The next thing I did was harden the balsa wood with some super glue thin. Balsa wood is very soft, and my next step was to cut and sand down the overhang so I'd have nice clean edges. If the balsa wood is hardened by super glue thin, this step is a little bit easier. You may prefer to keep the overhang for your project, but in a lot of games, having an unobscured base rim is really important. Once I shaved the overhang, I beat up the wood with my X-Acto knife, trying to age it a little, and then fully cleaned up the edge with some sandpaper. For a little added detail, I took a metal awl and punched some holes into the boards to give the impression of nail heads embedded below the surface of the wood. Next, we're heading to Tentacle Town. Green Stuff World sent me over this incredibly specific tool for rolling out various cylindrical things. It seems to work best for things like tentacles. I used epoxy sculpt, which is a little soft for this operation. It was kind of flopping around a lot. Green Stuff would be a lot better as it's a little bit more rigid. It should be noted that you could do something very similar with a household comb that you use for hair. Once I had a satisfactory tentacle, I glued it into the little area that I left for it with super glue. That marks the completion of the construction. Now on to painting. I started with black primer and then some white ink to build up the brightness in the middle of the base. I followed this up with more inks to shade and highlight those dark and light regions that I had established. Next, I did a little experimenting with some enamel washes. I took AK's streaking grime and covered the entire base in it. I then took dry paper towel and wiped away some of the wash, but I was concerned with the paper towel leaving fibers on the base. So I dabbed the paper towel in some white spirits, and that allowed me to be more gentle with the towel while still removing some of the wash, leaving the majority in the recesses. I did some dry brushing next, and this is kind of where I messed up. I didn't varnish in between this step and the previous one, and I think my enamel was still curing, so my dry brushing kind of messed it up, which is why this step makes the base look worse. Later, off camera, I reapplied some enamel wash to get more definition back. I painted the tentacle next with some desaturated blue and then highlighted it with a teal, and then got to the fun step. I took some purple ink and Yoo-hoo glue, which I apparently pronounced incorrectly in a previous video, and added some stringy goo to the tentacle and the deck of my ship, like the suckers were oozing some nasty stuff. I was really trying to get some strings that attached to the deck of this ship, and it was a little tricky, but I managed. Lastly, I cleaned off the base frame with some black paint, and this base was all finished up. Next up, we're heading to the Blood Isles. Step one for this base is we need some molds. I found a giant rock in my backyard and cleaned it off and painted some model latex on it in several layers. Once dry, I peeled off the molds and filled them with hydrocal, which is a really inexpensive plaster-based product. With these rock veneers, I can find sections that I like and glue them to my base. I can then trim the plaster to size and clean up the edges with some sandpaper. At some point, you may be asking,
Scott, this seems pretty complicated. Why can't I just glue rocks to my base?
You totally can, but the value here is that with molds, I can replicate textures. I don't need to go searching my backyard whenever I need to base something. And they're also pretty flat on one side, making gluing easy. And I can break them and sand them really easily and nicely. I can't tell you if that's worth the hassle for you personally, but for me, in certain scenarios, it is. Since neither the rock face or the base is perfectly flat, the next step is to fill the gaps between the base and the plaster with some epoxy sculpt. Next, I glued on some skulls that I sanded down halfway to make them look like the skull was kind of sunken below a water line, and then it was on to painting. I started with a black primer and then used white ink to highlight the areas closest to the shoreline. I did this because my next step is to use ink to paint the water. The darker area renders as darker red, whereas the area closer to the shoreline is brighter. The implication I'm going for here is that the blood gets deeper the farther away you get from land. Next up, I painted the rocks with a tan color and then dry brushed it several times with progressively brighter tones. To knock back some of the dustiness from dry brushing, I then washed it with a sepia color. This warmed it up nicely. Next, because this is kind of an arid place, I added some dry pigments to the base, a yellowish one and a reddish one, in moderation to get a more matte look in select areas. I then got the idea to make the red water kind of glowing, so I busted out my airbrush again and applied some more red ink near the shoreline, like either it's glowing a smidge or the blood is staining the rocks on the shore. I then very crudely painted the skulls with some grays and brighter grays. I glued on some desert-like tufts and then got to the fun part, which was applying Mod Podge's dimensional magic to the red river. This stuff is thick enough to not run off the edge of the base like a resin might, but it also gives you a really glossy look like resin would as well. It doesn't give you a whole lot of depth like resin might, but it beats not having to mask off the sides. To finish off this base, we paint the base rim black. On to our final and most difficult base, the Wintery Sci-Fi Outpost. This process begins with some plastic that has a cool metal texture on it. I found this stuff in my local Train hobby store. I took my circle cutter and cut it down to roughly the size of the base. I also cut another slightly smaller circle that I sliced a portion off of. This would be the second level to my platform. I took some double-sided tape and adhered my two platforms together. This allowed me to drill through both platforms at once and get holes in identical spots. Once I had all my holes, I was able to glue in styrene rod and lower my second level into place. Once I was happy with the height, I glued it all in place with thin plastic cement. I then began the very tedious process of cutting down more styrene rod to fit in between my various posts. I cut one length for the top and one length for the bottom. The gaps on these weren't perfect, so I filled them in with sprue goo, which is just plastic cement with leftover sprue melted down into liquid to form a thick glue-like substance that has some body to it. I figured that if any of this stuff was visible after priming, it would look like weld joints. Next, I made some stair stringers out of more styrene by taping them together and cutting and filing a single slot into them that would later receive a stair tread. Again, because they're taped together, I get identical profiles in each stringer. Once I had the shape looking right, I could take apart the stringers and glue them in place. I then took some more styrene and made a step with some more of that cool metal texture on it and then glued that into place. Now what about that longer pole? I found a cool bit in a dreadnought kit from Games Workshop to stick on top of it. Maybe it's an air raid siren, maybe it's a light post, I'm not sure, but it looks cool and sci-fi-y. I then took some floral wire and tediously wrapped it around the pole, starting at the bit and going down to a little electrical box that I made from styrene. Styrene, if you haven't gathered this already, is like an adult's version of Legos. You can pretty much make anything you want with it, and that's especially true for basic shapes like this box with the lid and some simple hinges. For the final detail, I added some wire mesh, which is typically used in large sculpting applications that I trimmed to size to fit in between my fence sections. I was careful to not use a lot of super glue here so that it wouldn't obscure the gaps in the fence. With that final detail, our construction is complete and we can move on to painting. Sorry to interrupt this broadcast. I have one quick announcement. On September 23rd, John and I's podcast, Trapped Under Plastic, is going to be debuting its first 2 episodes at the channel, linked right up there. Also in the description is a link to the website that has more conventional ways to listen, like Apple Podcasts or subscribing with whatever thing you use to listen to podcasts with. All right, that's it. Let's get back to painting this sexy base. Like all other bases, I started with a black primer undercoat and then base coated on several rusty tones like a dark brown red, oranges, etc. I then airbrushed on some AK Interactive chipping medium and let it air dry. After this, I covered everything in a desaturated blue color, and once that was dry, I got to town chipping the paint off. I took a damp, crusty brush and started to reactivate the chipping layer below the paint, which revealed the rusty red and orange tones below in a really realistic and fun way. I also did some scraping with my X-Acto knife, but be careful as you can expose the underlying plastic if you're a little more aggressive like I was. Next, I covered the whole thing in AK Interactive Streaking Grime. Once it looked dry, I took some white spirits and wiped a lot of it away, and what this did was make my platform look extra grimy. It didn't necessarily act like a wash, but more like a tint. Some areas collected more of the enamel wash than others, while others were just left with a slight filter of a brown color. I then locked it all in with a mixture of satin and matte varnish. I don't want the streaking grime getting lifted, nor do I want the chipping medium reactivating later down the road. To bring some metallic shine to the platform, I sponged on a pretty bright silver. I don't want all of the metal to be rusty. Next, I base coated the cables red and yellow, and now on to the snow step. Precision Ice and Snow sent me some products to try out. They sent along a 12-page manual that shows various ways to use their product, but I kind of ignored this and just dived right in. I applied some of their glue and then dropped on the snow product and blew away the excess. I'm fully aware that I'm not taking advantage of the full capabilities of this product, but I'm just dipping my toes right now. Next, I made some icicles by melting clear acrylic rods over a tea candle, which is a little bit more difficult than you think. You need to know when to apply heat and when not to, and when to start pulling on the rod and when not to. If that doesn't sound appealing to you, you can just buy some icicles from Green Stuff World. Glue those suckers on, paint that base rim black, or so help me God, and that's our fourth and final base complete. Vitali Tykin said it best in a comment on my last basing video. Bases are great fun, always brings a mini to life, I reckon. Scratches my diorama itch when I don't have much time. I couldn't agree more. The big dioramas can be scary for beginners and also time consuming for advanced people alike. This is a fantastic stepping stone for beginners and advanced people. Maybe you want to test an idea before engaging in a full diorama. Whatever your reasons are, basing is a lot of fun, and I hope you guys give it a shot. That's gonna do it for this one, guys. If you liked this video, I have another one in a very similar style that you can find linked right up there in the top right-hand corner. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are various ways that you can do that via buying merchandise like this hat right here, or other ways like my Patreon campaign or using my Amazon shopping affiliate link. They're all linked in the description and described down there. Also, if you like Skillshare and you want to get 2 months for free, consider using the link in the video description. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to hang more menace!